So a couple weeks ago, I did a little rant about the curation of the Genesis BBC Broadcasts box set. That video actually did surprisingly well by the admittedly low standards of my channel. I wonder if that was maybe just because people, went to the video expecting a review, which it wasn't because I hadn't heard the set at that time. But I do have the set now, right? And I wanted to follow up that video addressing some of the questions I had about how the set would be and following up on some of the thoughts that I have about how the tracks were chosen now that I've actually heard the thing. I'm mostly going to talk about how the sound quality of the Gabriel era stuff stacks up against previous releases, both official and unofficial. But there's also some pretty interesting details that I noted about the 80s material that I wanted to talk about as well. So stick around. As always, I'm Hans from the Contemporary Art Rock Project. Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. Check us out on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service. Now, I didn't say this in the first video in quite these words, but I suppose Genesis are in this interesting position of being both somehow simultaneously a cult band and one of the most popular bands in history, right? And you can sense the competing incentives that come from those two roles in most of what they've done in the last 25 years or so. You know, they have a way of recognizing, I think, the desires and priorities of hardcore fans while ultimately not being able to avoid thinking about and maybe prioritizing the possible responses that might be had to something by the many, many casual listeners who are also going to encounter this stuff. And I think the best way to understand the contents of this set ultimately is to recognize the way that both of those incentives exist in their minds. So I mentioned in the last video being kind of annoyed that we're yet again being given Shepherd, Pasadena, Let Us Now Make Love, since those were on the two previous, the Archives 1 and the 2008 box. Though I understand, every other way to get a hard copy of those songs is currently out of print or, is on a set that's quite expensive on the secondary market. But I did think it'd be kind of interesting, since that set of tracks has been released 3 times on 3 separate sets, to kind of see how the sound quality of those 3 releases has evolved. So I did some side-by-sides. So I'll start off with the song Pasadena. Just as an aside here, just an interesting note, on my copy of BBC Broadcasts, the track list gives the first 2 songs as being Shepherd, then Pasadena, but the actual disc contains Pasadena, then Shepherd. Obviously, that doesn't really matter at all. All the content is there, but I think it is a little embarrassing on a set of this kind of scale and profile that the very first thing you hear when you dig into it is a mistake. Anyway, if you look visually at the 3 versions of Pasadena, you can see that they get louder as we go, with the 2023 release being fairly pumped up by comparison. I'm not somebody who gets particularly worked up about, the loudness wars or whatever generally, and I'm not nearly as bothered by dynamic compression and mixing as many people are, or, by the urge to have everything louder. I've said this before, but I came of age in the CD era when loudness and compression were, very common. And they're a major aspect of a lot of the music that I listened to growing up. And I can hear the difference, but I'm mostly not that bothered by it. But I think it actually ends up making a significant difference in this instance for reasons that I'll go into in a bit. So let's listen to a few seconds of each version. Here's the release from the first Archives box back in '98. Here's the 2008 box. And here's the BBC Broadcasts version. Now, those do each have kind of a distinct character sonically. The Archive 1 release feels maybe a bit tinnier and sharper than the other 2. The 2023 version is maybe even a bit claustrophobic from being so loud. I actually like the 2008 version the best. I think it hits a good kind of Goldilocks point in terms of the volume, and it just kind of feels easy on the ears. But one consequence of how these three versions are mastered, right? Listen to the quiet part at the beginning of each song. Here's Archives 1. Here's 2008. Here's BBC Broadcasts. Now, is it just me, or is the tape hiss, at least I think it's tape hiss, that kind of white noise that's overlaid on top of everything, is it just me, or is that really present and noticeable in the 2023 release? I mean, obviously you can hear it in all three, but the BBC Broadcasts version is the only one where I find it actively abrasive, right? There's something about the combination of, how they've mastered it, how they've compressed it, how they've EQ'd it, that brings that white noise really much more to the kind of mental forefront when you're listening to it than it is on the two earlier official releases. And honestly, when I sat down to do this comparison, I assumed the three would basically be functionally identical. So I'm actually kind of surprised to have as strong a preference here as I do. So for fun, I just want to do Shepherd as well, which I should say as an aside. I didn't cover this in my Every Song's Ranked video, but this song is very, very dear to my heart. A wonderful little artifact of the time. So again, here is Archives 1.
So they ride through a valley of mist to a castle in the heavens.
Here's 2008.
So they ride through a valley of mist to a castle in the heavens.
And here's 2023.
So they ride through a valley of mist to a castle in the heavens.
Visually, you can see again the increase in the loudness. It's maybe even a little bit more pronounced here in terms of, the visual recognition of it. The archive version sounds a little crackly and obscure. The 2008 version is fuller and cleaner. The 2023 version almost feels a bit assaultive. And once again, if we pull out a very quiet part, you can really hear how the way that they've mastered it for the new release has kind of maximized that tape hiss artifact in a sort of a distracting way. So, like I said, I wasn't really expecting to have much preference between these three, but actually, to my ears, the 2008 box is by far the most enjoyable listening experience, and certainly the version that I'm going to be coming back to if I want to hear these songs again in the future. Now, next I want to talk about some of the 1972 material. In the last video I talked about how I have this BBC Sessions disc, I think it's right here, bootleg that I have that there's some references in the liner notes that tie this to right around the time the first Archives box was released, so 98 or so, right? So this is actually a bootleg that's contemporary with that first Archives box, and I would kind of assume was probably released partly to capitalize on the interest surrounding it, though I'm entirely speculating when I say that. And I talked about this release, in the last video I talked about this release, Watcher of the Skies, came out a few weeks ago on a label called Audio Vaults. It's actually for sale right now on Amazon UK if you want to pick up a copy of it. This is a very recent, not exactly, I don't know if you'd precisely call it a bootleg, but at least a gray market release, right? The back of it says that it's released under UK and European copyright regulations, not for sale in the USA. So I guess if you live in America, as I do, you could call it a bootleg. And this is a set of BBC recordings, all from 1972, that was released, again, I assume, to capitalize on interest around the BBC broadcast set, which came out within a couple weeks of it. I think I made the comparison in the last video to Snakes on a Train, Snakes on a Plane, right? So I kind of like these because they represent the state of bootlegs 25 years ago and the state of bootlegs now. Now, all three of these releases include the Sound of the 70s recording of Harold the Barrel from January 1972. Let's hear the 98 bootleg. and the 2023 Audio Vaults release.
A well-known bar restaurant owner disappeared early this morning.
And now the official release.
A well-known bar restaurant owner disappeared early this morning.
So in this case, the 98 version is barely listenable. The unofficial 2023 version is really quite loud. You can see visually here, it kind of looks like a Pantera song or something. And the official release, to its credit, has a full, clean sound with some decent dynamic space. So the official release wins by a pretty decent margin here, I think. One comparison that I think is very interesting, let's try the 1972 Sounds of the 70s version of Twilight Alehouse. Now, just in the visual here, you can see a couple interesting things. The 98 bootleg appears to have swapped the right and left channels, which is really pretty inconsequential, but kind of a fun detail to note, I think. And the 2023 Gray Market release is so loud that visually it doesn't look like it's even the same song. So let's listen to clips. Here's the 98 boot.
Is it really true what they're saying? Are you really sure there's nobody come for me?
Here's the Audio Vaults version.
Is it really true what they're saying? Are you really sure there's nobody come for me?
And here is the official release.
Is it really true what they're saying? Are you really sure there's nobody come for me?
Now, to my ears, the 98 boot actually sounds fine in this case. The official release sounds actually pretty similar to the 98 boot, interestingly enough. It's just not that different, certainly good. The 2023 Gray Market, it sounds like they've actually distorted the sound by pumping it up so loud, right? They've compressed it to the point that it's, if not clipping, at least like not sounding as good as it would if they didn't just, if they didn't blow the whole thing up like they do. So from a sound quality standpoint, obviously there are all kinds of versions of these tracks that are floating around out there, and this is a pretty arbitrary sampling. But I just think it's kind of interesting to get a sense of the spectrum of quality of, the same performances that are available on the official and unofficial versions. And I do want to give the official version credit here. The sound generally is full, clean, clear, lives in a decent enough dynamic space. They've done, to my ears, a pretty good job with that, leaving aside the fact that the 3 Nightride tracks kind of sound like crap. Now, I want to clarify a couple things that I said in the last video about the version here of Stagnation. I mixed up the 1970 Nightride version of Stagnation, which has a different coda with some different lyrics. I mixed that up with the 1971 Sounds of the 70s version of Stagnation, which is pretty much the same, minus a slightly less dense sound due to a lack of overdubs. Now, in the booklet to BBC Broadcasts, there's actually a quote from Mike Rutherford where he says that he thinks there are too many layers of acoustic guitar on the Trespass version of Stagnation, which I wouldn't, of course, agree with, but I suppose that does make the sound of the 70s version appealing by virtue of a cleaner arrangement, which probably explains why they put that both on here and then also on the Archive 1 box set. If I remember right, it was one of the only, on that Archive 1 box set, I think this was the only BBC session of a song that was otherwise available in studio form. So, to evaluate Mike's thoughts about that, I think it'd be interesting to actually compare the 2008 Nick Davis mix of Trespass with the Sounds of the 70s version.
Blessed are they who smile from bodies free. Seems to me like any other crowd. Blessed are they who smile from bodies free. Seems to me like any other crowd.
So the studio version does have this kind of tapestry effect where there's a really great number of sounds all kind of wrapped together, fighting a little bit for space, whereas the BBC version does feel a little bit cleaner. It's a bit slower, which makes it feel a little more placid, and, you can hear more of a unified sense of a distinct arrangement. Now, I actually really love both these versions, but I think when I put them side by side, I found that the contrast was actually more significant than I would have expected just from my memory of the studio version. Now, before I wrap up my thoughts on the Gabriel disc, I did want to offer just some kind of final thoughts about the overall track selection. I complained about the lack of comprehensiveness in the last video, but comparing this to the Watcher set and to other research I've done about what's out there from this period, it does seem that almost every song that was played in a BBC session during this era is represented here, right? The main absence that I can find being Return of the Giant Hogweed, and, with the asterisk that this version of Watcher of the Skies is a live one from 1975 rather than a BBC session in the conventional sense, and a few things about the arrangement had actually kind of evolved by 75. But in terms of presenting a clean-sounding alternate version from the period, this disc does quite well. And I mean, as something to sit down and listen to front to back, it's by far the most enjoyable relative to, the 98 bootleg and the unofficial release from 2023. The Watcher of the Skies set, the multiple versions that you get of the same song here, I mean, they're satisfying from an archivist standpoint, and I'm glad I have it for that reason. But it does mean that it's not really something that you'd want to listen to just for the sake of it, and not often at least, Despite my earlier gripes, I will admit that on the official release, they've mostly done a pretty good job of assembling something that's interesting and satisfying, enjoyable, and almost comprehensive enough. I will say, though, that I really do wish they had included the Nightride versions of Stagnation and Looking for Someone, and the 1971 Sounds of the 70s version of Musical Box, since all three of those versions were recorded before the songs were really quite pinned down and have some interesting variations relative to the original, right? I mean, I suppose, I do still have those on this set, and, the sound quality on this set for those three tracks is good enough, right? And I don't know how much they could have improved it for this release. But that's my main gripe, actually. In terms of making something listenable, minimally comprehensive, and not going to annoy a casual listener, I suppose they couldn't have necessarily done too much better. Now, the middle era stuff, the 5 songs from the 78 Nebworth show, the almost complete Lyceum show from 1980, I didn't own versions of those previously, and so I'm not, and I'm just generally not richly familiar with the bootlegs from either period, so I'm not going to do any sound comparisons for this release. I said in my last video that the Lyceum show is complete, but that was wrong, actually. I should acknowledge here that it's not. They've taken out the 5 songs which are taken from the Nebworth set to avoid overlap and repetition. They've also taken out, if I remember right, some of Phil's stage patter, or most or all of Phil's stage patter. Now, I get the rationale for that. In a perfect world, it would be great to have both shows complete. And I actually think you could do that without annoying the casual fan too much, right? Because this period is so satisfying live. It has such a rich set list. But not having heard any of these live versions before, this was quite a treat for me. I can probably live without the 5 songs from Lyceum, given that there are great versions of those on the set. And, the 2 discs where the 78 and 80 material appear, I'll be coming back to those quite a lot, I think. They're a very satisfying listening experience, as anyone who's already familiar with the Lyceum show would already know. Certainly, I think that it's superior to 3 Sides Live, right, where Phil's delivery of the Duke stuff really starts to get maybe a bit too loose, a bit too consumed with improvs and ad-libs, right? So if you're the kind of fan who already owns the Nebworth and Lyceum shows, there may actually not be too much here for you, right? I'm going to guess that, the boots are probably about as good a sound quality given the higher profile of the band at this point in the later era. I could be wrong about that. If you're the kind of collector who already has those two shows, this set may be redundant for you anyway. But if you're somebody who's just stuck with official releases up until now, which is how I've been for the live stuff from after Gabriel left, then you're in for a pretty massive treat if you pick this setup. And I think it's relatively easy to forgive some of the choices that they've made to make it a little more accessible to the non-hardcore. Now, the high pop era stuff, the shows from 87 and 92. In my earlier video, I mentioned the idea that these might represent sort of an alternate version of The Way We Walk. I cited a comment from Nick Davis in the booklet for the 2008 live box where he says the vocals on The Way We Walk he doesn't think are very good, frankly. And there's relatively little on BBC broadcasts that doesn't appear on The Way We Walk, pretty much just Brazilian and Los Indos. Most of the songs on The Way We Walk are represented on BBC broadcasts, with the exception of, surprisingly, of Land of Confusion, which is particularly surprising given that if they left that off for space considerations, they prioritized giving that space to the Calling All Stations material, which is a really interesting decision. And Tonight, Tonight, Tonight is also missing. Now, I want to lead this off with a detail that I actually think is quite fascinating. According to Wikipedia, if you trust that, the version of Mama on The Way We Walk is actually from the July 4 Wembley show that appears on BBC broadcasts, right? So Way We Walk actually already included this version of the song Mama. Same performance. But if you listen to the BBC broadcasts version of Mama, there's this little bit of feedback in the intro here. I don't know if you'd call that an improv or just a mistake, but it's not part of the standard performance of the song, and it doesn't appear on The Way We Walk. So the BBC broadcasts version actually leaves in a mistake that they snipped when they were compiling and editing The Way We Walk, which is a mistake that, to be clear, I think that little flub or whatever it is adds interest and character to the performance. So I think that's actually pretty cool. The version of That's All from the Wembley gig here is also the one they used from The Way We Walk. I believe that's the only other area of overlap between the two, assuming the Wikipedia entry is to be believed. It's also interesting to note, if you're really into this kind of thing, that The Way We Walk includes a version of Throwing It All Away, which is taken from the 92 Nebworth show, but they didn't put that track on the BBC broadcast set. Not that I'm complaining about that. Other thoughts on the Wembley set? It sounds good. It has good energy and performances. I'd be lying if I said this is my favorite era of the band, but, they're at the top of their game here, and you have to respect that. There's some interesting details in the bass. Check out this little extra bass filigree on the beginning of Home by the Sea. Now, unless it's totally hidden in the mix, I went back and checked, and I'm almost certain that the bass line is not being played in quite such a complex way, either on the studio version or on the Way We Walk version from 92. So kind of an interesting little detail there that they added and took away. Also, check out this little moment of slap bass at the beginning of the 87 version of Throwing It All Away. Not sure if that's Mike or Daryl doing that, but it's the sort of interesting little detail that makes live albums intriguing, at least to me. Now, bits and pieces of the Lyceum and Wembley shows appear on the second archives box, right? But that box kind of sucks anyway, and I'm not that interested in how those versions compare here, right? I'm more interested in how some of the performances on this set stack up to some of the performances on The Way We Walk. So in light of Nick's comments about the vocals on The Way We Walk, I picked a couple songs from that live album where I thought the vocals were maybe not the best sounding. I'm interested in how they compare to the BBC broadcasts version. So let's listen to just a little bit of the song No Son of Mine as it appears on The Way We Walk.
Well, the key to my survival was never in much doubt.
Now that song as it appears on BBC broadcasts on the Nebworth disc.
You're the key to my survival. Who's never in much doubt.
And a little bit of Driving the Last Spike as it appears on The Way We Walk.
Waving goodbye as I left them in tears, remembering all we'd said.
Now as it appears on the Nebworth BBC broadcast disc.
Waving goodbye as I left them in tears, remembering all we'd said.
So I don't know. The Way We Walk version might be a touch more nasal maybe, but it doesn't seem like a radical difference to me. I'm not sure I'd be able to hear much distinction at all if it were a blind test. You know, obviously for copyright reasons, I have to play a pretty short clip of both those two songs, but I've listened to more extended passages side by side, and my conclusion's basically been the same. And given the lack of any real difference in vocal sound, you know, honestly, at the end of the day, the stuff from 1992 is the least interesting to me of this whole set. The 87 stuff is a bit more energetic, it has more interesting details in the playing, the vocals sound better. You know, by the time of the 92 tour, there's some stuff on the We Can't Dance album that I adore, some stuff. But by the time of the 92 tour, you know, they really weren't taking any risks or leaving any room for spontaneity at all in terms of how the songs were played. Phil's voice was maybe just starting to age. And, you know, from what I was able to hear, there's pretty minimal difference between this and the pre-existing live album from this period. And of everything on the set, those tracks on disc 5 from the 92 show are probably what I'll come back to the least often. Now, as far as the two Calling All Stations tracks, you know, I don't know if there's too much to say about those, except, honestly, they both sound great. Not About Us is an acoustic version, which is very well performed. You know, you can hear a few places where Ray is kind of refining the vocal melody in some pretty smart, effective ways. It makes a great case, I think, for that being the best of the ballady songs on that album. Far and away the best, even, really. There's an excellent version of The Dividing Line, which is already a great song. And man, these two tracks really do make the case that there should be an official live album from that period, right? If you're going to acknowledge it to the extent that you put some tracks on this compilation, then, you know, give us a full-fledged live set from that era with the appropriate level of sound quality. It's funny, the essay in the booklet refers to the 97 lineup as being the least loved iteration of Genesis, and then bears that out by having 0 photos of the Calling All Stations lineup, despite their appearing on the set, while having at least one photo, for instance, of the Seconds Out lineup with Steve but no Peter, despite the fact that that lineup does not appear on this set. So overall thoughts about the set, you know, if you're a neurotic bootleg collector, you're probably going to find this redundant and also a little bit aggravating. But if you are someone who's only ever stuck to the official releases, or if you're someone who has some familiarity with the bootlegs and the BBC stuff, but not a comprehensive familiarity, it's a pretty good value for the money. It has some pretty good stuff. And, you know, even if it has been curated in a way that is maybe a little too respectful of the triggering or boredom of the casual fan, it is still quite entertaining to listen to for the most part on those merits. On the other hand, don't listen to this version of Shepherd or Pasadena or whatever. I'll leave that bit out. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and attention. Hope everybody has a good day, and I will see you next week.